with these profiles. So I hope my remarks will give you some ideas. As a member of Congress, being a member of Congress is like going to the university all the time. You hold hearings and you just have a fantastic opportunity to learn a lot. But you also learn something about the process of learning, and that is that people come to the Hill in hearings and they tell you what they think you want to hear, or they ignore things that they really don't want you to know. And so part of the process of learning in the Congress is knowing how to ask the right questions. Right questions to ask, you're not really going to get much of an answer, or you're going to get a spun answer, and you won't really get to the bare bones of what you're looking for. So hopefully during our session today, I'll give you some ideas on questions, how to ask good questions, how to do good research, and how to come up with a profile that is a little richer than what the press secretary of the various members of Congress would put out as the profile they wish you would adopt. And I also would point out a resource, if you haven't already. The Almanac of American Politics is a great resource. It's, I'm sure, online for students. Be careful not to plagiarize. You could take every one of those profiles in there of members of Congress. I would take as sort of a lodestar, something that you would like to do, but you've got to make it your own. You can't take it out of theirs. Well, where to begin? I guess beginning at the beginning is a good place. I was born and raised in southern Wisconsin. You've probably all heard of the town Janesville. It is where Paul Ryan is from. Paul Ryan, the vice presidential nominee of the Republicans in the last election. Paul Ryan graduated from my high school. I was the first member of Congress to graduate from my high school. The second one was Russ Feingold, a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin. And bringing up the rear, as I like to say, is Paul Ryan, who came from our high school as well. I went to the University of Wisconsin. I was a political science major. I'm also a double major with economics as well. I went to the University of Wisconsin Law School. And it was probably during two things in the earliest phases. When we'd gather around our family dinner table, my father and mother, who were, I'd say, moderate Republicans, nonetheless were interested in public affairs. We did not talk about the Green Bay Packers. We did not talk about, I'll date myself, the Milwaukee Braves. We really talked about politics and what the community ought to be doing, what the nation ought to be doing, what the state ought to be doing. And if I said one thing, my father would argue with me. And if I said the exact opposite, my father would argue with that. It didn't matter. Around our dinner table, we had respectful, but nonetheless, arguments over where the country ought to, I want to legalize pot. He doesn't want to do that. If he wants to legalize pot, I didn't tell him what's wrong with that. There was that kind of stuff going on around our dinner table. Then in high school was the next sort of jumping off point. I was on the debate team, and I was asked to defend right-to-work laws. Well, my father was a businessman, and he just didn't like labor unions, and he thought right-to-work laws were terrible. And so when the debate coach came to me and said, "Bob, you're gonna argue the pro right-to-work position," I was I don't think I'd been that depressed in my life at that point. I mean, what am I going to do with right to work laws? I don't believe in them. But it was a turning point for me because I was able, well, I learned that I'd be able to take a look at the other side of an issue and really come to understand it from the point of view of those who argue for that position. That was a sort of a turning point in my life in high school. I was able to begin to critically think about things. And I suppose it was the inner lawyer in me that was starting to blossom. How do you take a position representing somebody whose position you don't approve of or even agree with, and how can you go and effectively argue that position as an advocate? Well, then in college, there was the anti-war and civil rights movements. Vietnam was going. A lot of my friends went to Vietnam. Some of them didn't come back. That was a pretty traumatic part of our existence then, you know, when we were protesting the war in Vietnam and protesting for civil rights. So that was part of the crucible of my learning in college. And then I ended up, after law school, going to Michigan State University, and I was a graduate student in political science, had a Ford Foundation Fellowship. And after 8 years of higher education, I just got tired of the student standard of living. Hopefully you're not quite there yet, but at some point you want to buy a car, you want to have some nice clothes, you want to, you know, get a new computer or something. You know, you just get tired of it. So I hired on with the Attorney General of the state of Michigan. I became an assistant Attorney General. And one of the very few regrets that I have in life is that I did not complete my master's degree. And it's sort of a checkbox that I left unchecked. So one day I'm in East Lansing, Michigan. That's where Michigan State University is. There's 45,000 students on campus. It's a huge student body. And I am all of, what, 26 or 7 years old. And I decide at that point that I'm going to stay in Michigan, so I have to register to vote there. I kept my voting registration in Wisconsin thinking I was going to return. And I walked into the city clerk's office to register to vote. Simple. Well, I didn't go in a suit and tie. I went in with my blue jeans or whatever else I was wearing that day, a sweatshirt, and I asked to register to vote. So the city clerk said, she kind of sized me up and she started asking me a bunch of questions, which as a lawyer and as an assistant attorney general, I knew had nothing to do with registering to vote. But she asked them, and I wasn't there to make a big protest. I was there to get the job done and get on my way because I had to do some grocery shopping or some other things. So I just politely answered her questions. And then she popped the following question on me. Do you live in a housing unit where there is a communal bathroom? And my brain seized up. I went, whoa, what does that have to do with my right to vote? I'd given her my address, I'd given her my age, all these other things. And at that point, the brakes went on. I said, I'm not going to answer any more questions. This is silly. Just, I'm here to register to vote. Sign me up. She wouldn't do it. She just flat out said no. So I walked out of the city clerk's office in East Lansing, Michigan, and I walked down the street to a reporter at the local weekly newspaper, the Town Courier, to the reporter who I kind of had hots for. And I said, Linda, come on, let's go back to the city clerk's office. Actually, we did it the next day. This time we did it with a photographer in tow, and Linda stood behind me in line and went through the whole thing again, right down to the communal bathroom question. So that time, I was refused registration to vote, and we walked outside, and they took a picture, and the next day it's on the front page of the weekly newspaper in East Lansing, and then the following day after that, it was on the front page of the Lansing State Journal, again, that newspaper, and after that, it was just endless newspaper interviews, TV interviews, TV spots, the whole thing about how the city clerk of East Lansing, Michigan had refused to register to vote an assistant attorney general of the state of Michigan. Because when I was in there asking to register to vote, I didn't say, well, you don't know who you're talking to, I'm an assistant. I didn't do any of that stuff. So overnight, in this town that I hadn't lived in for very long, I was a one-day news story, or maybe 2 or 3 days. So this was right after the 18-year-old vote was passed. And some students on the campus at Michigan State University called me up and said, we'd like you to be the chairman of our student registration drive. I asked the Attorney General whether that was all right or not. And he said he didn't care. So I did. I signed up, and there I was in the front, on the front page again. And now I became the spokesperson, the talking head, the face of student registration. I wasn't a student, but I was close enough, and the city clerk had said no. Well, make a long story short, the reason I tell you that is that from my dining room table, through my experiences in college, through something that happened to me when I went to register to vote, all of those things sort of combined to my thinking that I ought to run for Congress. Now that's not a straight line, but when you go and ask the person you're profiling, how did you decide to run for Congress? Don't leave it there. They'll tell you something. They've answered that question a million times. Their staffs have answered that question a million times. Ask some questions behind that. You know, when did you first get an interest in politics? Was your family involved in politics? What kinds of conversations did you have with people who were in school with you about politics? Were you ever part of a protest movement? Did you ever sign a petition? Did you ever go and have some kind of moment, the voter registration moment, that got you really kind of angry and got your juices flowing about, I'd like to change that? Is there anything that you encountered with respect to the person who was already in the seat that you hold, that you found that gave you cause to want to take that person out politically? Don't rest with what they say on the answer on the first question. I mean, ask the introductory question, but then get to the follow-up, because it is more, there's a bigger story behind what motivated them to get into office than what they will initially tell you. And that's really important, because if you're trying to figure out what the profile of a member is, you want to find out if there's anything that connects those dots with what they do in office. How do they decide what committee to go to? How do they decide to spend their time? The most valuable thing a member of Congress has is time. The pressures on a member of Congress are not quite as high on those things you think are pressures. Like, am I for gun control or am I against gun control? I mean, listen, by the time you're asked that question and put to that question in a vote, you've danced around that, you've rationalized it one way or the other for years. I mean, that is not a hard thing to do because you've made your way. You've made your way. The bigger pressure on you is how do you spend your day? How do you spend your time? You know, how much time do you spend looking at legislation? How much time do you spend dealing with constituents? How much time do you spend with your staff? Much time do you spend with people who aren't on your staff? Time is the biggest problem, the biggest pressure that members of Congress face. It really isn't the issues as you might want to be led to believe, that people are, that somehow or other a member of Congress's mind is a rope in a tug of war between opposing causes. No, doesn't happen. Once in a while it does. But very, very rarely. Time is the biggest problem. How to spend your time, and how to spend your time effectively. You can spend your time doing nothing, and nothing gets done. And maybe that's the way you like it. Maybe your member of Congress is in a safe district, doesn't have to worry about re-election, has one of those platinum names like a Kennedy name or something, is there on a cruise. There are members of Congress like that. They're there, they might as well be on a cruise. They're cruising through life, they got a fancy title, they got staff, nothing particularly motivates them. When you ask questions about how they got to Congress, well, it was sort of like, Daddy bought me the seat or something like that. That's maybe too simplistic, but there are certain people who are part of family dynasties, and it just sort of happens. They didn't really have to work that hard, or the stars line up and they're at the right place at the right time, and a bolt of lightning, they're suddenly a member of Congress, and it's a safe seat. They don't have to do very much, very little pressure. They're on a cruise. Others are there on a mission. Others, and you'll discern this from how you ask the questions of how they got there and what influences how they spend their time. You'll find out that some people are on a mission. They really want to accomplish something. It's almost kind of a fool's errand because in Congress, you don't accomplish anything by yourself. There are very, 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 very few things that a member of Congress can do and really, in their heart and in their mind, own it. It's a collective body. It is a community. It is how can you... So some members are very persuasive with their colleagues. And they spend a lot of time, coming back to the word time, they spend a lot of time with their colleagues. They try to get to know their colleagues and what make them tick and what motivates them and what turns them off. And they'll try to get relationships going with their colleagues. Other people don't care. Other people in the Congress don't care. They could care. They probably know as many people on the day they leave Congress as the day they came to Congress. They don't go out. They're not outgoing. They're not. They don't try to find out what their neighbor, even in their hallway, in the Rayburn building or the Longworth building. They're strangers with the person next door. And the other thing that you'll find is that all of these members of Congress, are judged by society and at law as being equal. And I think what I'm challenging you to do is to find out what makes the member you're profiling unique. So that means you have to have a point of reference. And hopefully, John, that comes about when they talk with one another about what they found out. Because you can't, the only way to do it really is to go and profile 5 members of Congress. And the comparative profile will tell you a lot. You'll learn a lot, but you don't have time for that, right? So maybe you can educate one another about what you're finding out.
One of the things we will do, which gives me an idea, Bob, and thanks for pointing that out, is they are going to present to each other orally,
right.
So that will be part of what the subsequent people will talk about. And maybe in the future, as we fine-tune this idea, thank you again, we might ask for at least 2 profiles to be done rather than.
No, it's a time
It's a
issue.
matter of
Yeah,
time.
yeah, it is a time issue, so. I hope we got that on the table.
We didn't lose anything.
I think that was a martini. Anyway, so you know, that's a little flavor. Let me go through a bunch of high points in my career, and hopefully you'll have some questions of me. And use me really as a laboratory. Ask me the kind of questions you'd ask the person you're going to profile, or the staff person that you have to ask about this.
And low points too, Bob.
And the low points too, yeah. High points and low points. Well, of course, the high points, number one, keep in mind, let's talk about the Congress as a whole. A lot of people think that the Congress is a place, how many people, let me ask you as a question, how many people here think that Congress is a place where things are supposed to happen? Yeah? Congress makes something happen. All right, you flunk. You all flunk. You flunk. The design of Congress, I'll get to you in a minute. The design of Congress is to make sure something doesn't happen. Think about it. The Parliament, and this, I'll come back to this in a minute because this gets to comparative politics. The Parliament of the UK or Canada is a legislative body that's designed to make things happen. Our government, our Constitution, is the progeny of the parliamentary experience. And our founding fathers had a different point of view. How do we prevent things from happening? So they designed a government, a constitution with a Congress with 2 branches, checking and balancing one another, and the Congress as a whole checking and balancing the executive. And the 2 of them checks and balances with the judiciary, the Supreme Court. The whole idea is to slow things down and make it impossible for anything quickly to happen. That's the purpose of the Constitution. So I'd like to deprogram the idea that's probably in your head that Congress is supposed to make things happen. No. Congress is supposed to prevent things from happening. Now we get into a rub, and I can get to it later, some questions. There are certain things that have to happen every year, like budgets and appropriations and funding of government, you know, those are where the joints of this check and balance thing is really rubbing raw, and it's rubbing raw right now. Because the advantage goes to those people who want the status quo or who do not want something to happen. That's the advantage in Congress. And we can talk about whether the people in Congress who want to prevent things from happening have too much power, a la the filibuster and things like that, or whether it's just right, or maybe for some people, not enough can happen. Think about the gun control debate right now. Enormous advantage in the status quo. Here you have a president using the bully pulpit, Newtown, a couple of states, Connecticut and Maryland, passing new measures to reduce gun violence. Yeah. And those who want that to happen, I do, you know, easily can demean the NRA, which I used to be a member of and left because the nuts took over. The fact of the matter is, the system is on the side of the NRA. The checks and balances work to the advantage of the NRA. The people who want change are pushing a boulder up a hill. But that's how our Congress was designed. It was designed not to be easy. And it has frustrated many of us in the things we want to have happen. But if you get a more charitable view about what Congress is all about, you may not like it. I'm not asking you to like it. I don't like it. But I'm asking you to at least have a little philosophy about it. Be philosophical. It more easily apportions your task as the burden of going forward and the burden of persuasion if you want change and it's not coming. On the other hand, if you don't want change on a particular item, then you can probably feel pretty satisfied in our system of checks and balances. If anything happens, it's going to happen slowly. Nothing overnight. But that's kind of the grounding of things. So this kind of informs you about your individual members. Where is the individual member you're profiling? Where is their power? Where is their biggest advantage? Their biggest advantage is just kind of doing nothing, because the checks and balances will make sure nothing happens. If your member of Congress is one of those people who's on a mission, you'll probably want to ask some questions about what are they doing to push that boulder up the hill? How can they do that? What levers of power do they have to make something happen in an institution that is status quo oriented? The default is status quo. Okay? High points.